This North London industrial estate was built in the 60s, not long after I was born. It's all breeze blocks and corrugated plastic. During the late 80s, early 90s, there was a high turnover of firms, dressmakers, costume jewellers and the like. They would set up, make a bit of money, go bust and then disappear. But there's one firm on the estate that was established in 1871, and the original Victorian tools and methods of working are still in use. The firm is owned and worked just by one man. He is my father, and he may well be the last of the Flowermakers. I remember you telling me about one of your first visits to the business when you were about 14.
Yes, one of my first jobs, all those times ago, when Uncle Will, that's my Uncle Will, he was in charge of the business then. His father, my granddad Blore, he was coming home one night and got run over by a horse and cart outside Chingford Station. I think it was probably the coal cart. So, and then Uncle Will took over from him. And then I went to work years later for Uncle Will when the business was based in Hackney, in a sort of old Hackney type townhouse. And we used to work in the basement down to about 4 stairs into a sort of basement where we used to hand cut out with these mallets. There was a sheet of lead and we used to cut out by hand, just by, here's the cutter, look. And just chop it out, and when the lead got too rough to work on, we used to hammer it flat again with this hammer here.
Right, so this machine is a later innovation,
yes.
then, yeah?
When you know, after some years when I'd taken over, I had the opportunity to buy a machine, and this basically just cut out the hard work. It did exactly the same thing. That just goes up and down, and you just put the cutter under and it cuts out. So it doesn't give you the aching shoulder that these things used to.
Yeah.
Mind you, it made you jolly strong, broadened my shoulders no end. As from a weedy lad, I developed into quite a hefty young man using these, I feel sure. Whether that's got anything to do with the pain in my shoulder now, I don't know.
So the original workshop, what was the cutting out room like then? What did it look like?
It was dark, lit by a gas jet, one of those fishtail things. And that was our only light. And when we'd cut out some pieces, we used to gather them up in our apron as a rule, because you used to cut them out and put all the pieces in, and then you could sort of just pick your apron up like that. And go up to the, and you used to go up the steps, across a sort of yard, into a workshop at the end, where there was a lot of young girls who did the actual making of the flowers. And then you could sort of tip your...
So they did the veining and the
They did the veining and the making up.
In a sort of separate workshop.
In a separate workshop, yes.
Recently, I wrote to the Museum of London to see if there was anything in their archives about the flower making trade in the 1870s. They wrote back saying they had very little information on the subject, and if I found out anything, could I please let them know. One thing they did dig out for me was this: a piece in the programme for the Sweated Industries exhibition, put on by the Daily News in 1906.
Artificial flower making is one of the most interesting of the London home trades. It is also one of the worst paid. Great skill and a natural aptitude, combined with intense application, will enable a worker to earn 2d per hour, though many fall below this standard. Physical strength and endurance play no unimportant part in making roses and other flowers, whose petals have to be subjected to great pressure that they may assume and retain the requisite concave form. Sitting hour after hour at a table, a stiff rubber pad in front of her, a small gas stove beside her, in which she warms her steel tools, the worker proceeds to separate the cakes of petals and subject them all to pressure of the warm tool upon the rubber pad until they assume the necessary contour.
And this was taken in 1907. This is Uncle Will. There's Grandad Blore. That's my dad, little Cliffy. Cousin Chris, who was killed in the war. And here's my Grandma Blore and my dad again with his little embroidered collar.
So Uncle Will died in about 1947, and you took the business over. Yeah?
That's right.
What state was the business in then? When you
Well, it was mothballed really during the war. Nothing was happening, and when Uncle Will died, although he left it to my dad, I decided I'd have a go at making it work.
Right.
And we came over to the place and sorted out some tools, and I cut out one or two tentative flower shapes and made up some samples, searched through the old ledgers and found some customers, and went up to the city and started hawking my wares, as they say, and managed to get a couple of orders then.
So how did you actually learn, the techniques of flower making?
Well, I didn't know anything about it at all, but luckily an outdoor worker came knocking on the door who was an experienced flower maker, and she started actually putting the things together.
So she'd worked.
She'd worked
previously
before with, not actually with Uncle Will, but a similar firm.
Right.
So she knew all the techniques and how to make flowers. I didn't. I knew how to cut them out and how to colour them.
Mm-hmm.
But that side of it was a mystery to me.
Yeah.
And I really only found out gradually by these. I had about 3 good outdoor workers who were good artificial flower makers,
Yeah.
and by watching what they did, I more or less found out for myself. And then later on, when they died, because they were all older than me,
Yeah.
I was able to make them myself.
Right.
And and it changed too.
Yeah, I mean, first you were mainly cake decorations.
That's right, little wedding cake flowers we made mostly.
Yeah.
And then when the polythene flowers started coming in from the Far East,
Yeah.
they were so cheap, and all the bakers went on for these cheaper little flowers,
Yeah.
which I couldn't compete with anyway.
And you shifted.
And I gradually shifted emphasis onto stage work,
Right.
which was much more to my liking. It's big and bold, and the it changed from whatever the show wanted. It didn't necessarily want realistic flowers. It often wanted something quite unusual,
Yeah.
like ivy, bright blue. We did once for something. Mostly it's sort of run-of-the-mill ivy, like this. This trials of this we've made for the Phantom of the Opera, for instance. There's the one set which is set in a graveyard with all this ivy covering the tombstones, and I mean I sold it at so much a yard.
Right. Yeah.
Still do. And at the same time, there's dressmakers.
Yeah.
They will, if I'm making a particular dress, they'll send me the offcuts of the dress and that material, and I'll make it up into a little rose to go on their dress using the same material.
Right.
Like this.
So you've got the two outlets, the theatre and the dress design.
Dress designers, really.
And 1871, and the original Victorian tools and methods of working are still in use. The firm is owned and worked just by one man. He is my father, and he may well be the last of the Flowermakers. This North London industrial estate was built in the 60s. I remember you telling me about one of your first visits to the business when you were about 14.
Yes, one of my first jobs, all those times ago, when Uncle Will, that's my Uncle Will, he was in charge of the business then. His father, my granddad Blore, he was coming home one night and got run over by...
Not long after I was born. It's all breeze blocks and corrugated plastic. During the late 80s, early 90s, there was a high turnover of firms, dressmakers, costume jewellers and the like. They would set up, make a bit of money, go bust and then disappear. But there's one firm on the estate that was established